I have the pleasure of introducing to you Angela Glover Blackwell. So I just have a couple of things I want to say. First of all, Angela is one of the most gracious people that I've ever met. She is kind, she is loving, she is professional, she's efficient, she's strategic, she's beautiful, and just a powerful force working on behalf of social justice. And so I want you to know that Angela Glover Blackwell is not just a social justice advocate who has spent most of her adult life working to advance the cause of economic and social equity for all. She is the founder and CEO of PolicyLink, and we've seen a lot of the slides that were up here when Manuel was speaking that come from the work that her organization does. And they are a national research and action institute advancing economic and social equity. So after growing up in the racially segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s, Angela attended Howard University and later learned a law degree. Can you guess from where? UC Berkeley. Yes. For 10 years, she was a partner at the renowned public interest law firm Public Advocates, dedicated to serving the underrepresented. And Ms. Blackwell won victories in several class action cases and helped develop the firm's strategies in the areas of education, employment, health, and consumer affairs. And then went on in 1987, Angela Blackwell established the Urban Strategies Council in Oakland, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And Angela continued to earn a national recognition for her work there, which involved community building in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. Now, her approach has been built around a thorough understanding of the local condition, community-driven institutional reform, and a commitment to accountability. After leaving the Urban Strategies Council, Ms. Blackwell worked for 3 years as a senior vice president in the domestic and cultural departments at the Rockefeller Foundation. And her work there focused on policy issues surrounding race and inclusion, and she spearheaded the development of it's called the Next Generation Leadership. So all the talking we're doing about being sure that young people are here is something that Ms. Blackwell has been doing for a very long time. In 1999, Angela Blackwell founded PolicyLink, which I already told you, and that organization is devoted to ensuring that equity issues are taken into account in policy-making decisions with special focuses on infrastructure. So Ms. Blackwell's extensive work has made her a leading authority on race and equity issues in America. She's a co-author of Uncommon Ground, Race in America's Future, and contributed to the anthology Ending Poverty in America, How to Restore the American Dream. And so today, we have the honor of hearing Angela Blackwell speak about the superior model for promoting belonging, which is equity. So please help me not only thank Angela for being here, but for all of her many years of dedicated work on the behalf of all of us. Thank you, Angela. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I must say that despite the fact that I literally give hundreds of talks a year, this one has me really anxious. So anxious to the point that I think I really didn't want to do it. When I arrived home yesterday from being here, my husband said, Julie Nelson called you. I said, oh, good, they probably ran out of space and they don't need me to do this tomorrow. And I spoke to Julie, and that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to tell me to get mic'd up over there. And then this morning, when Shakti didn't mention my name, I thought, phew, they run out of space, they're going to move along, and I don't have to do this. But obviously, here I am, I do have to do it. And I've had to ask myself, why have I been so anxious? One reason is because I'm the CEO of PolicyLink, and that is exactly what the name suggests. We focus on policy. And the last thing I want to do in the middle of an extraordinary conversation that has been lifting us up, inspiring us, affirming us, challenging us, helping us to understand the larger context in which our work happens. The last thing I want to do is be the one to start talking about policy and parse all the things that you've been talking about into transportation, or education, or health policy, or housing policy, and move into those dreaded silos and lose the spirit of what's going on here. I don't want to be the one that did that. But that is what I do. That's what I talk about. But obviously I do it because I believe. I believe the things that were lifted up in the morning conversation yesterday, where we talked about our connectedness and our interconnectedness. I absolutely believe that, and most of the people I work with believe that. I absolutely believe that we have to embrace the humanity of all. I absolutely believe it, and most of the people I work with believe it also. And I understand that hate and greed and the delusion of separateness have been institutionalized. Those are the things we heard about yesterday, and as I sat and I listened, I thought, don't be so afraid to get up and talk with your colleagues, because if that's what this is about, that's what policy has to be about. But how do you lift it up and frame it in a way that that becomes obvious? Too often, we move too quickly, those of us who think about policy, to the policy fix. We move too quickly to the silo. We assume that everybody knows that we embrace humanity. We assume that everybody knows that everything is everything, that everything is connected, that we are all one. And when we have moved into the really minute part of a policy, we assume that people are going to give us a pass on the fact that it doesn't look like you understood it. And you shouldn't give a pass to policy people who go there, because if you don't carry those values that we've been talking about with you all the way down to writing one sentence in the regulation, I guarantee you, you will lose it. And so I'm happy to be here to talk about this, because we all understand, I think someone even said it yesterday, that the arc of our moral universe is long and it bends toward justice. We often associate that with Dr. King, but Dr. King, when he wrote about it, put it in quotation marks, because it was Theodore Parker who probably first said it, or perhaps not. He's the first person who's associated with it, the Unitarian minister in 1857 who was speaking out against slavery. He was trying to abolish slavery. 1857. It is a long arc, is it not? We understand that, and we understand that those of us who are organizing, who are providing services, who are leading as elected officials, who are developing policy, we all are trying to put in our piece to be able to help that bend, to speed up that bend. It won't happen if we don't do our piece. But those of us who are thinking about policy need to create a policy framework that encompasses the things we talked about. It has to be a policy framework that embraces the humanity. It has to be a framework that goes beyond merely thinking about our interconnectedness, but actually acting on it. We believe, and many of you believe, and people are starting to believe all across the world, that equity turns out to be that framework, that we need to be doing this work in the context of equity. And when I use the term equity, what do I mean? Just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. All. Just and fair inclusion. Every one of those words is absolutely important, and a policy frame that embraces and works from equity is one that keeps us constantly thinking about how to hold the values, the spiritual commitment, the deep connectedness and understanding in all of the policy work that we do. It is essential that we do that. And in doing that, we have to constantly push back on the tendency to just get the policy in place. That when we're thinking about all, it really does mean all. But it is hard for people to see themselves in that word. We see it here, that we've been talking about all from the very first moment that this began, and yet it's still hard for people to see themselves in that word. Therefore, we have to be in touch with all. We have to be listening and engaging and responding to the particular circumstances, because equity looks at the end and says, what do we want all to achieve? And then it backs into what the inputs have to be in order to get there. And for different individuals, for different groups, those inputs are different. I was just asked to speak up. I sure hope that doesn't mean that all this time you all in the back didn't hear me. We absolutely have to make sure that people can see themselves and that we're paying attention to the individual journey, to the group journey, because that's the only way that we get it right. We talk a lot at PolicyLink about racial equity. Sometimes that has us talking about people who are African American, sometimes Latino, sometimes Asian, sometimes American Indians, sometimes Native Americans, sometimes people with disabilities, sometimes people who are lesbian and gay and bisexual and trans and questioning and queer and inquiring, all of that, because we are all of that. People of color are all of that. And yet, if we don't pay particular attention to calling it out, to talking to people, to understanding their journey, we miss something along the way. And so the equity frame, I believe, is the right frame. But the equity frame doesn't remove the obligation to interact, to engage, to hear, to listen, to check yourself, to check your policy, to ask the question, is it going to produce the results that we want? One of the things we know, and the work that Manuel presented to you yesterday, I'm sure lifted this up, is that our demographics are changing. They're changing rapidly. And we think this raises a new sense of urgency about getting the equity agenda right, because the very people who have been systematically left behind absolutely will determine the future. Absolutely will determine the future. Those who we have been underinvesting in, those who we have been marginalizing, those who we have been othering, now are the drivers of the future. It brings a new urgency. But we won't be able to respond to that urgency if we don't understand everybody's journey and everybody's circumstance. Doing that creates an extraordinary outcome, because we know that when we focus on those who are most vulnerable, we get it right for everybody. I've been talking about this for years and using an example which I'm going to use in a second, but I've decided to stop just talking about it and write about it, and I had to challenge myself whether the example I was using was one example or whether it really is true, and you see it play out all over the place. The example I use is this: the curb cutouts that you see every place in every city you go into, that allows people in wheelchairs, people with disabilities, to be able to maneuver across town or community with more ease. Those cutouts are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities, the advocacy of people in wheelchairs. Ed Roberts, who is right here from the Bay Area, was one of the leaders to help make that happen. And it was essential because it wasn't enough to get rights that had been proclaimed from the Capitol to say people with disabilities had the right to this and the right to that. Those rights were empty without the ability to be able to physically maneuver through communities. They're there to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are able to move toward reaching their full potential. But how many times have you been pushing a baby carriage and you've been so happy you didn't have to pick up that contraption? How many times have you been pulling a suitcase and you made that train because you were able to swiftly move across town? How many times have workers seen their burden eased as they were pulling wagons and pushing carts? Or maybe it's pulling wagons and maybe it's the opposite, you know what I mean. And how many times have your minds been put at ease when a new bike rider, 7, 8 years old, is able to traverse the community sidewalk to sidewalk, not riding in the street? When you solve problems for people who are most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. But let me tell you some other instances of that. I know that you are happy that when you go on an airplane, it is not filled with smoke. Now, many of you are too young to remember many things. You probably don't remember when all your family could meet you at the gate. You probably never experienced that with balloons and teddy bears, and that was a very nice thing. But it used to be that you could smoke on a plane, and you could smoke any place on a plane. I can't tell you how many times I took a plane ride and the person next to me in that ashtray, they don't even have ashtrays anymore on the plane, they were putting it out all the time. Well, you can't smoke on a plane anymore. And at first, what they did is they created a smoking section, right? And if you were in the front and it was in the back, you may have felt you made progress, but when you were in the row just before the smoking section, you might as well have been sitting in the smoking section. So who do you think we can thank for the fact that you can't smoke any place on a plane? The flight attendants. The flight attendants, because putting the smoking section did not help them. And when we finally solved that problem for those who were most vulnerable, we solved it for everybody. And it led to where we now you can't smoke any place, but it started there on the plane. Bike paths. Who's the most vulnerable on the street, other than the pedestrians, of course? It is the people on bicycles. When New York City created a bike lane on 9th Avenue, within the first year, leaving aside people on bicycles, traffic injuries went down 50%, and pedestrian injuries went down 30%. When you solve problems for those who are most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. And so we have this wonderful moment that if we can embrace our connectedness, if we can embrace our humanity, if we can understand the word all, and understand that all does not leave anybody out, and it is not enough to feel that or to mean it, you have to call it out, you have to know people, you have to include them, you have to hear them. If we can lift up just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, we are on the road to equity. And that is a frame that allows us to think about policy that moves us toward belonging. And as we embrace this policy frame that moves us toward belonging, it puts extreme pressure on anybody being an advocate for policy, development of policy, passing policies or implementing policies, to constantly bring back to this litmus test of is it leading up to the values that we encompass when we say we're doing equity work. And when we do that, we have to push ourselves to ask, who is the most vulnerable? And we want to do that because it is the moral thing to do. We want to ask who is most vulnerable because it is the moral thing to do, to ask, to find the answer, and to use that as your starting point, and to use how that group, that individual is doing as your measure of how we are doing. And the gift is that when you get it right, you get it right for everybody. The gift that when you get it right in that context, you stand on a platform and you can go all the way up. Go back to the plane. When they created a smoking section, they set up the need to come back and visit it again. But when you got rid of smoking altogether, you could move on to the next. When we get it right for those who are most vulnerable, we get it right for everyone. When we lead with equity, we set up a challenge that meets the spirit and the values that we've been talking about here. Thank you.